Michael Harris boarded the 710 Delta flight from Richmond International Airport with Emily, his 7-year-old daughter, settling into 12F. Vanessa Langford, CEO of Langford Dynamics, was forced into 12E when a hydraulic fault grounded the first-class cabin. She grimaced at the father-daughter pair beside her, his faded flannel shirt, her hand-stitched purple dress, the duct-taped backpack wedged under the seat in front of them. While Emily slept against his shoulder, Michael quietly pressed 2 fingers to a small device hidden beneath his sleeve. At 32,000 feet, 2 F-22 Raptors materialized off the wing. Flanking the aircraft in perfect formation, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. A distinguished passenger has been honored by the United States Air Force. Vanessa turned, stunned, to the man beside her. If you're enjoying stories where people get judged before their true worth is known, subscribe. This one is just getting started. 3 hours earlier, the morning had started the way it always did, in apartment 4C at the Ashcroft complex on Midlothian Turnpike. Emily's medications lined the kitchen counter in the order Michael had memorized down to the milligram. Fluticasone at 7 a.m., albuterol rescue inhaler positioned exactly 3 inches from the edge of the counter so small hands could reach it without stretching. The walls that had once held a Meritus service medal and a framed photo of his old unit now held Emily's drawings, each one signed Emily with a heart dotted over the I. He made her breakfast the way he made everything for her, with a precision that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with love. Scrambled eggs, 1 slice of American cheese folded in at the last second so it melted without turning rubbery. Toast cut into triangles because squares were boring in Emily's words and circles were for babies. Orange juice cut with water, a ratio he'd worked out over 11 months of trial and error after learning full-strength juice sometimes triggered her cough. "Daddy, will the mountains be bigger than the buildings downtown?" Emily asked, hunched over a drawing of an airplane with 2 stick figures visible through an oversized window, one labeled Daddy, one labeled me. "Much bigger, sweetheart," he said, setting her plate down. "Some of them still have snow on top even in July." Her rasp, the small, familiar catch in her breathing that had been part of their lives since she was 3, didn't stop the grin that spread across her face. This trip to Colorado Springs had taken Michael 7 months of night shift security work at a self-storage facility on Hill Street to save for. Dr. Aaron Whitefield, one of only 4 pulmonologists in the country running the trial protocol for her condition, worked out of the National Jewish Health Campus in Denver, 90 minutes from where they'd be staying. Michael checked their documents one final time, printed boarding passes because he'd never trusted the app not to glitch at the worst moment. Emily's medical summary sealed in a manila envelope, emergency contacts written in permanent marker in case a phone died, his own ID that said nothing about who he used to be. Colonel Michael Harris, U.S. Air Force, 67th Network Warfare Squadron, was quietly discharged 4 years ago following a classified budget diversion investigation that named him but never publicly explained him. He hadn't fought it. Fighting it would have meant naming operations that were still active, still protecting people who had no idea a scapegoat had made that choice for them. His wife, Denise, stayed 7 months after the discharge papers came through, then left for a mortgage broker in Midlothian who didn't want a sick stepdaughter cutting into his golf schedule. Michael signed the custody agreement without a fight. Emily was the only thing he'd never once considered negotiating. Now he worked whatever his back would allow. Warehouse shifts at the Amazon Fulfillment Center off Meadowville Road when construction dried up, security work when neither was available. The device on his wrist, an old ANW2C tactical transponder he was never supposed to keep, hadn't been active in 4 years. At the gate, Emily rode on his shoulders to see over the crowd, laughing so hard she nearly lost her rabbit, a threadbare thing named Colonel Fluff, her joke, not his. She charmed the TSA agent into scanning the rabbit as safety. Michael, from habit he couldn't unlearn, cataloged the exits anyway. They boarded 20 minutes later. Emily took the window, Michael took 12F, and in seat 12E, Vanessa Langford was already deciding she wanted nothing to do with either of them. Across town, in a corner unit penthouse on the 14th floor of the Riverfront Tower on Tredegar Street, Vanessa's morning ran on a different schedule. Her alarm was set to 4:30 a.m., synced not to any obligation, but to the opening bell in Tokyo, because she believed and had built a $9 billion company on the belief that staying 2 steps ahead of a pattern is the only real advantage left. Coffee, imported from a farm in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica she owned 11% of, brewed itself at 4:35. By 4:40, she was 3 overnight briefings deep, her mind already moving faster than most people's did before they'd finished their first cup. Langford Dynamics didn't build weapons, not in the way people pictured them, no warheads, no rifles. What Langford built was quieter and, in her opinion, more dangerous. Predictive threat assessment software. Encryption architecture the NSA quietly licensed for 2 of its own field divisions, and now her newest project, a machine learning defense platform called Sentinel-9, 18 months and $60 million in development, which she was scheduled to present in 9 hours at the Mountain Strategic Systems Symposium outside of Colorado Springs. She dressed the way she did everything, for maximum calculated effect. A charcoal Brunello Cucinelli suit, her grandmother's diamond studs, the only sentimental thing she owned, a watch that synced to 17 time zones and cost more than most people's cars.
The call came as she stepped into her Tesla. "Miss Langford, we're very sorry. There's a hydraulic issue with the first-class cabin on your 710. We can offer you our top economy row or rebook you tomorrow with a full refund." There was no real choice. The symposium wouldn't wait, and neither did she. She agreed to the downgrade with the kind of clipped, controlled fury that would end someone's morning at Delta's Richmond operations desk, though she wouldn't personally witness it. People who inconvenienced her simply stopped existing in her professional orbit. She didn't think about them twice. Walking through the economy boarding line felt to Vanessa like conducting field research in a culture she'd never needed to understand. Families with too much luggage and not enough patience, a man in a Carhartt jacket asleep before the plane had even pushed back. She cataloged it all with the same detachment she brought to a spreadsheet. Data points, not people. Then she reached row 12. The man in 12F had a child asleep. No, not yet asleep, but drowsy, against his shoulder. A stuffed rabbit wedged between them, a backpack held together with duct tape shoved under the seat ahead. His shirt had been washed so many times the plaid had gone soft and gray at the collar. Vanessa's jaw tightened before she'd even sat down. Everything about them, the clothes, the backpack, the careful way the man checked his daughter's inhaler before checking anything else, read to her like the kind of quiet, grinding poverty her parents had raised her to step around, not sit next to. She settled into 12E, opened her laptop, and did not look at either of them again, or try not to. "Story, Daddy," Emily murmured, medication already pulling her under. "Once upon a time," Michael said quietly, "there was a girl who could paint the sky just by looking at it." Vanessa's eyes flicked sideways despite herself. There was something in the man's voice, a stillness, an economy of movement that didn't match the rest of him. She filed it away as nothing. Construction workers could love their kids too, that wasn't rare. What was rare, in her experience, was competence, and nothing about seat 12F suggested competence to her. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude. The seatbelt light dinged off. Emily's breathing slowed into the deep, even rhythm of real sleep, her small hand still fisted in her father's shirt. Michael waited another 11 minutes, long enough to be sure she was fully under, before his right hand drifted to his left wrist, fingers finding the worn edge of a cuff that hid something Vanessa Langford, for all her $9 billion of predictive intelligence, would never have guessed was there. The device was an ANW2C tactical transponder, roughly the size of a wristwatch face, and it had no business still functioning. 4 years ago, in a windowless out-processing office at Joint Base Langley Eustis, a major named Holloway handed Michael a clipboard and told him to surrender all classified equipment, effective immediately. Michael turned in 3 transponders that day. He had not turned in this one. He'd told himself it was an oversight. He knew, even then, it wasn't. Since his discharge, he'd activated it exactly 6 times, never for longer than 2 seconds, never with any real expectation that anyone was still listening. It was a habit closer to grief than hope, a man visiting a grave that technically shouldn't exist anymore. His fingers found the recessed switch beneath the cuff. He hesitated, the way he always did, weighing the old paranoia, someone's watching, someone's always watching, against the small, stubborn part of him that needed once in a while to remember he had once been more than a night shift security guard with a sick kid and a duct-taped backpack. Emily's breathing was slow and even against his shoulder. He pressed the switch. The burst lasted 1.8 seconds, a compressed packet of encrypted authentication data, meaningless static to any commercial receiver, but structured, if the right systems were still listening, to unfold into something else entirely. A unit designation, a service number, a status flag that should have been purged from every database in the Department of Defense, and for reasons no one had ever explained to him, had not. He didn't know, and had no way of knowing, that 410 miles to the west, inside a hardened operations floor beneath Cheyenne Mountain, a duty officer named Renata Oduya watched a screen that had been dark for 4 years suddenly populate with a single line of green text. Unit 3117, designation active, authentication confirmed. He didn't know, and had no way of knowing, that she stood so fast her chair rolled backward into a filing cabinet. He didn't know that within 90 seconds a phone was ringing in the office of Brigadier General Thomas Vail, who picked it up, listened for 11 seconds, and said only, "Get me flight tracking, now." Inside the cabin, none of that was visible. What was visible, 4 minutes later, was 2 gray shapes dropping out of clear sky off the aircraft's 7 o'clock position, closing the distance with a precision that made the whole maneuver look less like an escort and more like something out of a recruiting film. The F-22 Raptors matched the Boeing speed and held station at a distance close enough to see the pilots' helmets through the windows, far enough to avoid so much of a ripple of turbulence. Phones came out across the cabin, seatbelt sign or no seatbelt sign. A woman 2 rows up gasped. A kid pressed his whole face to the glass. The captain's voice, when it finally came over the intercom, had a rattled edge that 15 years of commercial flying clearly hadn't prepared him for. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently being escorted by 2 United States Air Force F-22 Raptors out of Joint Base Langley, Eustis. This is not, I repeat, not a standard procedure, and there is no cause for alarm." A pause, muffled voices audible behind him, someone arguing on the other end of the radio. "We've been informed that a distinguished member of the United States Armed Forces is aboard this aircraft and is being honored at this time by an aerial salute. On behalf of the flight crew, we thank this individual for their service."
The jets held formation for 90 seconds exactly. Michael counted it out of pure habit, the way he'd once burned times on a stopwatch, before peeling away in a mirror image break, as clean and synchronized as their arrival had been. The cabin erupted, applause, craned necks, a dozen people scanning the rows for a uniform, a chest full of ribbons, someone who looked like what a hero was supposed to look like. Nobody looked at 12F. Except Vanessa Langford, who had gripped her armrest hard enough to leave 4 white crescents in the leather, and who was now staring, really staring for the first time, at the man beside her, who hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, hadn't done a single thing except pull his sleeping daughter a fraction of an inch closer. "That was—" Vanessa started, then stopped, unsure how to finish a sentence she'd never had to construct before. "Quite something." Michael glanced at her, his face giving away nothing. "The military likes their ceremonies. You said that like someone who'd know. Everyone knows someone who served." The deflection came smooth and practiced, the kind of answer built to close a door rather than open one. Vanessa, who had spent 18 years learning to read the difference between a closed door and a locked one, filed that one away too. Emily stirred against her father's shoulder, murmured something about mountains, and settled again. Michael's attention shifted instantly, a small automatic check of her breathing, the color in her cheeks, the angle of her neck against the seat. Vanessa recognized the posture. It was the same one her own security detail used scanning a room, except this wasn't professional vigilance. This was something else, something that didn't have a line item in any budget she'd ever approved. "Your daughter, she's beautiful." "She's everything," Michael said simply. 2 words. Vanessa had negotiated contracts worth more than the GDP of small countries and rarely felt outmaneuvered in a conversation, but something about the flatness of those 2 words, no performance in them at all, left her without a follow-up. The plane began its descent into Colorado Springs Municipal Airport 40 minutes later, the front range rising up through the windows like something out of a postcard. Emily woke as the cabin pressure shifted, her hand finding her father's on instinct before her eyes had even opened fully. "Are we there, Daddy?" "Almost, sweetheart. Look, you can see them now." Her face transformed, nose pressed to the glass, and Vanessa found herself watching the child's wonder instead of her own phone for the first time in longer than she could remember. When had she last looked at anything like this 7-year-old was looking at a mountain range she'd seen from a plane exactly once in her life? The landing was routine, smooth, uneventful, forgettable in every way except one. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Vanessa stood first, eager to put the flight behind her, gathering her bag from the overhead bin with the brisk authority that made strangers step aside without being asked. She'd made it maybe 10 feet up the aisle when the forward cabin door opened from the jet bridge side, before the plane had even reached the gate, before any of the standard deplaning procedure had begun. Flight attendants straightened. A ripple of confusion moved through the first few rows. Brigadier General Thomas Vail stepped on the aircraft the way weather moves into a valley. You felt it before you understood what it was. 41 years of service sat on his uniform in ribbon bars and unit citations that told a story most of the economy cabin would never be cleared to hear. 2 aides flanked him, their eyes already moving row by row with the particular scan of people who did this kind of thing professionally. Vanessa's stomach dropped. Her mind went immediately, absurdly, to Sentinel-9. Was this about a funding delay, a compliance flag, something buried in a procurement file with her company's name on it? She began rehearsing an explanation. Vail walked past her without so much as a glance. He stopped at row 12, where Michael was crouching, zipping Emily's backpack, double-checking the inhaler in her jacket pocket. The entire cabin seemed to lean forward at once, the understanding arriving in a single collective breath. This was who the Jets had come for, this ordinary-looking man in a faded flannel shirt, the single father who'd spent 3 hours holding a sleeping child. "Colonel Harris," Grand General Vail said, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had signed orders that got people killed and lived every day since with the arithmetic of it. "Unit 3117 remembers." Michael straightened slowly, Emily's small hand still in his. "General," he said, one word. It carried 4 years in it. The weathered face of Vail's cracked into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite grief, the particular expression of a man who'd rehearsed this moment more times than he'd admit and still hadn't found the right words for it. 4 years, Mike. 4 years the whole community's been waiting for you to break radio silence for real. That signal today, the authentication codes lit boards that haven't blinked since the day you walked out of Langley. Some of us never believed the official story, not for one day. "This isn't the place, Tom." Michael's voice stayed low, even, but his eyes dropped just for a second to Emily, who was watching the exchange with the particular intensity kids bring to adult conversations they're not supposed to fully understand, but understand anyway. Vail caught the look and nodded, recalibrating instantly. "Of course, but the invitation stands. Whenever you're ready, the community owes you a debt we're not going to pretend we can pay off in a jet bridge." He turned to Emily, and something in his posture softened in a way that didn't match the ribbons on his chest at all. "You must be the famous Emily. Your father used to talk about you constantly back when he could still talk to us."
Emily studied him with the same unflinching directness she'd used on the TSA agent that morning. He doesn't talk about the old days much. He says the best stories are the ones we're living right now. "Your father," Vail said, and his voice caught slightly,
was always the wisest man in the unit. Take care of him, young lady. He's more important than he lets anybody know. I know, Emily said. Matter of fact, the way only a 7-year-old could deliver something devastating. One of Vale's aides stepped forward with a leather folder, but Michael shook his head, a small, precise motion. Not now. Not here. Vale accepted it without pushing. Then at least let us arrange your transport. My car's outside. We'll take a cab, Tom. Emily likes seeing the city from ground level. As the small military contingent withdrew back down the jet bridge, the cabin erupted into a low buzz of speculation and excited whispering. Phones angled, a few passengers openly staring. Michael was already moving, lifting Emily onto his hip with the ease of long practice, avoiding eye contact with the row of strangers now looking at him like he was something entirely different than the man who'd boarded that morning. He passed Vanessa in the aisle. For a fraction of a second their eyes met, and what she saw there wasn't pride, it wasn't satisfaction, it was something closer to exhaustion. The look of a man for whom being seen had become a weight he'd learned to carry, rather than something he'd ever wanted back. If Michael's story has changed the way you see him, consider subscribing. You haven't seen his biggest impact yet. Colonel, she said. The word felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar territory for someone who'd spent her whole adult life being the one other people addressed with careful titles. Just Michael, he corrected, gently but firmly. That other person really doesn't exist anymore. Emily lifted her head from his shoulder just enough to be heard. Yes, he does, she said, with total 7-year-old certainty. He just wears different clothes now. Vanessa didn't have an answer for that. She stood in the aisle of a half-empty economy cabin, holding a laptop bag that contained 18 months and $60 million of predictive threat software, and realized she'd spent 3 hours sitting next to a man whose actual value she hadn't come within a mile of calculating. By the time she reached the terminal at Colorado Springs Municipal, Michael and Emily were already gone, folded into a yellow cab headed toward a Best Western on North Academy Boulevard that cost $89 a night. Vanessa stood at the curb for a moment longer than she needed to, watching the cab pull away, turning over a thought she couldn't quite finish, that she had looked at that man in seat 12F that morning and seen everything she'd been trained since childhood to dismiss. Worn clothes, a duct-taped backpack, a job that didn't pay enough to matter, and been catastrophically, completely wrong. Her driver was waiting. The Mountain Strategic Systems Symposium started in 4 hours, and Sentinel-9 wasn't going to present itself. She got in the car, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, her mind wasn't on the pitch at all. The Mountain Strategic Systems Symposium was held inside the Peterson Analysis Center, a windowless annex attached to Building 470 on Peterson Space Force Base, its walls lined with the kind of pale gray acoustic paneling that made every voice sound slightly too loud. Vanessa had presented here 4 times before. Each appearance cemented her reputation as the sharpest mind in private sector defense technology under 40. This year's presentation was meant to be the crown of that reputation. She stood at the podium in a fresh charcoal suit, no trace on her face of the flight 3 hours earlier, her slides moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd given this pitch in her sleep. Sentinel-9 doesn't just respond to threats, it anticipates them. It models adversarial behavior faster than any human analyst, without the friction of emotion or ethical hesitation slowing the decision loop. In 11,000 simulated engagements, it achieved a successful interdiction rate of 98.4%. May I ask a question? The voice came from the back of the room, quiet, but it carried like certain voices do, not by volume, but by the fact that people stop what they're doing to listen. Michael stood near the door in the same worn flannel from the flight, a visitor's badge, Visitor, M. Harris, escort required, clipped crookedly to his shirt pocket. General Vale, seated in the front row, raised one hand slightly, and the 2 junior officers who'd started toward Michael stopped where they stood. The floor recognizes our special advisory consultant, Vale said, the title deliberately vague and carrying more weight for it. Michael started down the center aisle.
Your model assumes adversarial behavior follows patterns learned from historical engagement data. What happens when the adversary knows they're being modeled? When they feed your system 9 months of clean, consistent decoy behavior, specifically so it learns the wrong baseline and then acts completely outside that baseline the one time it counts. He reached the front of the room. Vanessa felt the floor of her own presentation tilt slightly under her. In signals, we called it poisoning the well, Michael continued. Your system is genuinely impressive, Miss Langford, but it's only as good as the data it trusts, and any competent adversary with enough patience can teach it to trust the wrong thing. Admiral Renata Chen, seated near the aisle, leaned forward. Colonel Harris, are you telling this room the entire predictive AI defense model has a structural blind spot? I'm telling this room that any system built to learn from enemy behavior can be taught to learn the wrong lesson. Sentinel-9 needs what we used to call a doubt protocol, a second layer that assumes the first layer's training data might already be compromised and actively hunts for what it's been conditioned not to see.
Vanessa's carefully built pitch was unraveling in real time in front of 11 of the most powerful people in American defense procurement, and some part of her, the part that had built a $9 billion company on being the smartest person in every room she entered, was already racing 3 steps ahead of her own panic, mapping the flaw he'd just named. You're saying the entire learning architecture could be compromised through deliberate long-term misinformation, Vanessa said slowly. In my old unit, we ran operations built specifically to train enemy systems on false signal traffic. 6, sometimes 9 months of manufactured signal traffic. By the time we struck, their AI had been taught in painstaking detail not to see us coming. It wasn't that their intelligence was bad, it's that their intelligence was too consistent, too clean. Reality's never that clean. That would require running 2 competing systems simultaneously, one that learns and one whose entire function is to distrust everything the first one concludes. Michael met her eyes for the first time since walking into the room. Welcome to the paradox of electronic warfare, Miss Langford. The moment you trust your own intelligence completely is the moment you've already lost. General Vale stood, smoothing his jacket. Perhaps Miss Langford and Colonel Harris should continue this discussion somewhere with a higher clearance level. As the room began filing out, murmuring, Vanessa found herself standing 3 feet from the man she'd dismissed as barely worth acknowledging 6 hours earlier. You just dismantled 18 months of work in 4 minutes, she said. There was no anger in it, just something closer to awe. I didn't dismantle it, I improved it. Your technology could genuinely change the shape of modern defense, Miss Langford. It just needs to learn how to doubt itself. Where's Emily? Vanessa glanced toward the door as if the girl might materialize. With General Vale's wife, Michael said, something in his face loosening slightly. Margaret got a golden retriever and, according to Emily, makes cookies that are basically magic. They've met before. They found Margaret Vale's kitchen, technically a break room on the 2nd floor of Building 470, that someone long ago outfitted with a coffee maker and a hot plate, with Emily perched on a stool, covered in flour, narrating something to a patient-looking woman in her 60s. She spotted Michael first. "Daddy, Mrs. Margaret let me put in the chocolate chips myself. I did not eat raw dough. That's a lie if anyone tells you that." "Duly noted," Michael said, lifting her off the stool. The secure conference space 3 levels below Building 470, its walls lined with copper mesh shielding, a habit left over from a Cold War the room predated by decades, became over the next 6 hours the site of something Vanessa's engineering team would later describe in internal memos as the most productive single afternoon in company history. Her lead architect, a soft-spoken systems engineer named Priya Raghunathan, ran point on implementation, while 4 other engineers fed code across 3 linked monitors. The doubt protocol Michael described in the auditorium kept collapsing on itself in testing. The 2 systems, meant to check each other, kept quietly agreeing. "It's not working," Vanessa admitted, 6 hours and 2 cold cups of coffee later.
Michael had spent most of the afternoon in the corner with Emily on his lap, working through a coloring book, glancing at the monitors every so often the way a man checks the weather, habitual, unhurried. He stood now, settling Emily carefully into his vacated chair. "May I?" He moved to the keyboard. What he typed wasn't elegant. Priya would later call it brutally utilitarian, borderline ugly, and completely correct, but it worked differently than anything already on the screen. "You've taught them to doubt the data," Michael said, fingers still moving. "You haven't taught them to doubt the framework they're using to interpret the data. That's the actual gap." He pulled up a simulation, modeled loosely, though not identically, on an operation from his own service record, a case where an adversary had fed false communications traffic for months, plausible in almost every respect, except one detail nobody on the other side had thought to fake: local call-to-prayer timing. 5 times a day, the decoy traffic kept running, while the real operators went dark for 11 minutes. The absence of absence, his team had called it back then. The simulation ran. Sentinel-9's new doubt layer flagged the anomaly within 4 seconds, a pattern every previous version of the model had completely missed. The room, tired as it was, erupted. "It's not about finding what's wrong," one of the junior engineers said, half out of his chair. "It's about finding what's too consistent to be real." Michael nodded, stepping back from the keyboard. "You've taught them to doubt the data," Michael said, with a satisfied smile. "You haven't taught them to doubt the framework they're using to interpret the data. That's the actual gap." He returned to Emily, who looked up from her coloring book without missing a beat. "Did you fix it, Daddy?" "Just help them see it a different way, sweetheart." Vanessa watched the exchange, something tightening in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. "Your daughter seems remarkably calm as a 7-year-old in a room with copper mesh in the walls." "She's been in rooms like this before," Michael said carefully, "when she was younger." Emily looked up. "I was 3. Daddy used to work in a place kind of like this. Then some people lied about him and we had to leave. Mommy left too, but that's okay. She wasn't very nice anyway." The delivery was so casual, so entirely without self-pity, that it landed harder than anything Vanessa had heard all day. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then tried again. "Stories like this are why we're here. Subscribe because Michael's journey is about to come full circle." "I'd like to hear more," she said. "Both of you. Over dinner. My treat for what you did today."
Emily's face lit up instantly. "Can we get mac and cheese?" "Where's Emily?" Vanessa asked, glancing toward the door as if the girl might materialize. "With General Vale's mife," Michael said, something in his face loosening slightly. "Margaret got a golden retriever and, according to Emily, makes cookies that are basically magic. They've met before." They found Margaret Vale's kitchen, technically a break room on the 2nd floor of Building 470, that someone long ago outfitted with a coffee maker and a hot plate, with Emily perched on a stool, covered in flour, narrating something to a patient-looking woman in her 60s. She spotted Michael first. "Daddy, Mrs. Margaret let me put in the chocolate chips myself. I did not eat any raw dough. That's a lie if anyone tells you that." "Duly noted," Michael said, lifting her off the stool. The secure conference space 3 levels below Building 470, its walls lined with copper mesh shielding, a habit left over from a Cold War the room predated by decades, became over the next 6 hours the site of something Vanessa's engineering team would later describe in internal memos as the most productive single afternoon in company history. Her lead architect, a soft-spoken systems engineer named Priya Raghunathan, ran point on implementation, while 4 other engineers fed code across 3 linked monitors. The doubt protocol Michael had described in the auditorium kept collapsing on itself in testing. The 2 systems, meant to check each other, kept quietly agreeing. "It's not working," Vanessa admitted, 6 hours and 2 cold cups of coffee later. Michael had spent most of the afternoon in the corner with Emily on his lap, working through a coloring book, glancing at the monitors every so often the way a man checks the weather, habitual, unhurried. He stood now, settling Emily carefully into his vacated chair. "May I?" He moved to the keyboard. What he typed wasn't elegant. Priya would later call it brutally utilitarian, borderline ugly, and completely correct, but it worked differently than anything already on the screen. You've taught them to doubt the data. You haven't taught them to doubt the framework they're using to interpret the data. That's the actual gap. He pulled up a simulation modeled loosely, though not identically, on an operation from his own service record, a case where an adversary had fed false communications traffic for months, flawless in almost every respect except one detail nobody on the other side had thought to fake: local call to prayer timing. 5 times a day, the decoy traffic kept running while the real operators went dark for 11 minutes. The absence of absence, his team had called it back then. The simulation ran. Sentinel-9's new doubt layer flagged the anomaly within 4 seconds, a pattern every previous version of the model had completely missed. The room, tired as it was, erupted. "It's not about finding what's wrong," one of the junior engineers said, half out of his chair. "It's about finding what's too consistent to be real." Michael nodded, stepping back from the keyboard. "We had a saying in the unit: perfect intelligence is always a lie because reality's never perfect." He returned to Emily, who looked up from her coloring book without missing a beat. "Did you fix it, Daddy?" "Just help them see it a different way, sweetheart." Vanessa watched the exchange, something tightening in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. "Your daughter seems remarkably calm for a 7-year-old in a room with copper mesh in the walls." "She's been in rooms like this before," Michael said carefully, "when she was younger." "I was 3. Daddy used to work in a place kind of like this. Then some people lied about him and we had to leave. Mommy left too, but that's okay. She wasn't very nice anyway." The delivery was so casual, so entirely without self-pity, that it landed harder than anything she'd heard all day. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I'd like to hear more," she said. "Both of you, over dinner. My treat for what you did today." Emily's face lit up instantly. "Can we get mac and cheese?" Michael looked between his daughter and Vanessa. "Ms. Langford probably has more sophisticated taste than a drive-through, sweetheart." "I know a place that does truffle mac and cheese," Vanessa said, already pulling out her phone, "if that counts." It counted. The restaurant, a place called Ferrero's on Tejon Street in downtown Colorado Springs, occupied that narrow middle ground between upscale and welcoming to a 7-year-old in a flower-dusted dress. They took a corner booth. Vanessa, who had negotiated 9-figure defense contracts without so much as a raised pulse, found herself oddly nervous watching Michael's practiced hands help Emily with her inhaler before the food even arrived. 2 puffs, a 10-second hold, done so smoothly it barely interrupted the conversation. "You have really pretty hair," Emily announced, studying Vanessa with total seriousness. "It's like Elsa's from Frozen." Vanessa touched her own platinum blonde bun self-consciously. "Thank you, though I suspect Elsa's requires less product. Daddy says your hair probably costs more than our rent." "Emily," Michael's face went red, "that is not dinner conversation." But Vanessa was laughing, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she couldn't remember the last time she'd produced without meaning to perform it for somebody. "Your dad's probably right. It is a little absurd when you think about it." "Why don't you have kids?" Emily asked, again with the same total lack of filter. "Don't you like them?" The question landed like something dropped from a height. Michael tensed, visibly bracing to redirect his daughter, but Vanessa held up her hand. She wanted to answer this one. "I don't think I'd be very good at it," she said. "My parents believed children should be efficient, productive, not loved just for existing, earned like everything else. They sent me to boarding school in Connecticut when I was 6. I saw them maybe 3 times a year after that." Emily's face scrunched. "That's silly. Kids don't have to do anything to be loved. They just have to be kids." She looked to her father for confirmation. "Right, Daddy?" "That's right, sweetheart. Love isn't something you earn."
"Your parents were wrong," Emily told Vanessa, with a flat certainty of someone stating a fact about the solar system. "You'd probably be a good mom if you tried. You just need practice." Something in Vanessa's chest, some load-bearing wall she'd spent 34 years reinforcing, quietly gave way. "Is that why you didn't fight back?" she asked Michael, once Emily had wandered toward the dessert case with the waiter. "When they scapegoated you? Because of her?" They could take my rank, my clearance, my name, basically. Michael's hand rested on the table where Emily's had been a moment earlier. They could take her. Fighting it meant depositions, lawyers, reporters camped outside our building. She was already sick, already losing her mother to a divorce she didn't ask for. She needed one parent who wasn't in a legal battle for 2 years straight. He paused, and the truth would have named operations that were still active, still protecting people. My name wasn't worth more than their lives. Langford Dynamics has excellent medical coverage, Vanessa said carefully. If you were a consultant, full-time, Emily's treatment. I won't take charity, not for her, especially not for her. It wouldn't be charity. You rebuilt my entire threat model in an afternoon. That's worth more than you're letting yourself believe. Emily returned mid-conversation, chocolate ice cream on her chin, and tugged at the sleeve of Vanessa's blazer. Will you see us again? I'd like that, Vanessa said, and meant it more than she expected to. The proposal arrived at Michael's apartment 3 days later, a thick envelope, medical benefits itemized in language that made his chest tighten, a salary that felt like a typo. He left it on the kitchen table, unopened, for 2 of those 3 days, Emily's drawings watching him from the wall, like a jury he hadn't yet convinced. On the 3rd night, Emily found him at the table, the envelope finally open in front of him, Vanessa's handwritten note sitting on top of the printed pages. This isn't charity. This is recognition of value your country failed to see. I won't make that mistake. Is that from Miss Vanessa? Emily climbed onto his lap without waiting for permission, the way she always did. She likes you, Daddy. It's complicated, sweetheart. You're both lonely, Emily said, with the devastating simplicity only a 7-year-old could manage. Lonely people should help each other not be lonely anymore. He called Vanessa the next morning. They met at her office on the 11th floor of the riverfront tower. I have conditions, he said. I'm listening. First, I stay a ghost. No press release, no announcement, no name on a masthead. Expected. Second, Emily comes first. Always. Not second to a deadline, not second to a board meeting. Agreed without negotiation. Third, I want lab access after hours, personal projects related to her condition. Vanessa leaned forward. You're trying to solve it yourself. I have to try. I have a better idea, she said. Langford Dynamics needs a medical technology division. You'd run it. Full resources, full staff, full budget authority. That's not what I asked for. It's what Emily deserves, what kids like her deserves. Fine, but I want something too. Dinner once a week. Emily should grow up knowing strong women exist who aren't afraid of her questions. 6 weeks after that first flight, General Vale stood at a podium inside the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes and read a statement that corrected a record 4 years wrong. Unit 3117's existence, still mostly classified, was acknowledged in the narrow, careful language the military used for things it wasn't fully ready to explain. Colonel Michael Harris's discharge was reclassified not as disgrace but as sacrifice made in silence to protect operations and people who would never know his name. Emily sat in the front row in a navy dress Vanessa had bought without telling anyone, swinging her legs, watching her father walk to the podium with the bearing of a soldier who'd never actually stopped being one, whatever his paycheck had said for 4 years. When it came time for remarks, Michael did something nobody in the room expected. My daughter asked if she could say something, and he lifted her up to the microphone. Emily looked out at 3 rows of stars and ribbons, entirely unbothered. My daddy doesn't like speeches. He says actions matter more than words, so I'm going to say the words for him. Thank you for remembering he's a hero. He never forgot. Neither did I. But mostly, thank you for letting him come back. Not to the Air Force, just to himself. He smiles more now. The applause went on longer than protocol probably allowed. Across the room, Vanessa wiped her face with the back of her hand and didn't bother pretending she wasn't crying. 6 months after that first flight, Vanessa stood outside apartment 4C, holding a bottle of wine and a pint of Emily's favorite ice cream. These Thursday dinners had quietly become load-bearing in all 3 of their lives, though none of them had said so out loud. The door opened before she knocked. "Daddy said you'd be exactly on time. You're always exactly on time." Later, after Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, Michael and Vanessa sat with the last of the wine. "We've been circling this for months," he said. "I know. I'm terrified." "Good. Means it matters." He took her hand. "You're already family, Vanessa. We're just waiting for you to admit it." "I love you, both of you." From the couch, without opening her eyes, Emily's voice drifted over. "Finally, can we go home now? All of us?" A year later, the Harris Langford Pediatric Respiratory Center opened its doors on the Langford Dynamics Medical Campus, funded in full, built around a prototype breathing assist device Michael had spent 11 months helping design. Emily cut the ribbon herself, breathing easier than she had in 4 years. No fanfare, no cameras beyond the local paper, exactly the way her father would have wanted it. If Michael and Emily's story meant something to you, subscribe for more stories about people whose worth was overlooked.